Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. To gain a better understanding of Chopin's musical aesthetics, assuming that that's actually possible, we first need to understand how he learned. It may be an imperfect exercise, but it's highly relevant to today's topic. Every musician is shaped by the tradition they inherit, the teachers they study with, and the musical world in which they grow up. Chopin was no exception. But the story of his education is rather unusual and certainly not the one we might expect. One important distinction is that Chopin's first piano lessons took place at home with his mother and his older sister, Ludwika. He later studied music with Wojciech Adalbert Żywny. Bohemian by birth, Żywny moved to Poland as a young man and became a music tutor to members of the aristocracy and the upper middle class. Although he played the piano and probably advertised himself as a piano teacher, there is no evidence that Żywny provided the kind of systematic pianistic training that many biographies attribute to him. In fact, he was known primarily as a violinist and organist. He taught Chopin between the ages of 6 and 11, and although Chopin was already considered something of a prodigy, there is no surviving record of a formal piano curriculum, no evidence of a systematic technical method, and no indication that Żywny was responsible for developing the extraordinary pianistic technique for which Chopin later became famous. It is highly unlikely that by the end of those lessons, when Żywny reportedly declared that his pupil had surpassed him, Chopin possessed anything resembling the virtuoso technique he would later develop. This matters because Chopin's education has often been framed through a familiar narrative: the great teacher who discovers and shapes the great genius. Think of Liszt and Czerny, or Friedman and Leschetizky. Since nearly every celebrated virtuoso is expected to have had an equally celebrated piano master, Żywny gradually came to occupy that role in Chopin's biography, despite lacking the usual pedigree. The sources, however, paint a more complicated picture. We know that Chopin studied with Żywny, but we know remarkably little about what those lessons actually consisted of. The truth is that, pianistically speaking, Chopin was largely self-taught. That does not diminish Żywny's importance. His greatest influence may not have been technical, but cultural. He transmitted a musical tradition. Chopin's education was rooted in an older world. Żywny, born in 1756, the same year as Mozart, belonged to a generation shaped by the 18th century German keyboard tradition. This was the world of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's essay on the true art of playing keyboard instruments, first published in 1753, only 3 years after his father Johann Sebastian died. The essay was one of the most influential keyboard treatises of the 18th century. It emphasized expressive playing, rhetorical phrasing, and sensitivity to harmony, while at the same time discussing practical elements of keyboard playing, of course. Whether or not Żywny shaped Chopin's technique, he belonged to this tradition, and Chopin absorbed many of its values. Why does this matter? Because many aspects of Chopin's aesthetics make far more sense when viewed through the lens of 18th century performance practice. His rubato, for example, as I discussed in a previous video, with the accompaniment playing strictly while the melody playing freely, was unlike that of most of his contemporaries, precisely because it reflected 18th century principles. His emphasis on part writing, inherited from older contrapuntal traditions, is another example, an aspect of his music that we find consistently throughout his compositional career, from the early Rondo alla Mazur, Opus 5, to the late Nocturne in B major, Opus 62, number 1. Even details such as his treatment of trills and embellishments reveal an aesthetic rooted in an earlier keyboard culture. And this last point, as you can gather from the title, is today's topic. How did Chopin understand and perform trills? What follows is essentially an instruction manual for navigating the situations in which pianists tend to become confused. The online resources available are often confusing as well. And painful as it is for me to say, piano teachers, which I'm one, are not always immune to misconceptions. I say this without criticism. No teacher can be expected to know every interpretive detail of every composer, of course. A bit of history. During the 18th century, composers who explained how to perform ornaments generally agreed that a trill began from what we call the upper auxiliary note, that is, the note immediately above the written note. If a trill sign appears over a C, for example, the trill begins on D. We know this from the so-called tables of ornaments, charts in which composers explain the symbols found in their music and how to interpret and perform them. Among the best known is the one that Jean-Henri d'Anglebert included in the preface to his keyboard suites in 1689. François Couperin also left us one in 1713. D'Anglebert's table was influential in the way Johann Sebastian Bach devised his own, since we know that he copied D'Anglebert's table around 1710. The table of ornaments we find at the beginning of the notebook for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, compiled in 1720 for his son, shows remarkable similarities. D'Anglebert's table also became a model for Jean-Philippe Rameau's own table in the preface to his suites. All these tables of ornaments show us that a trill should begin from the upper note. Naturally, the key signature determines the accidentals involved. Throughout the 18th century, and we see from d'Anglebert's table even earlier, this was simply how trills were understood. And as an ornament, the trill begins on the beat, with a note, the upper note, that melodically creates momentary friction against the harmony before resolving into it. So when we hear a concluding trill in a Mozart sonata, for example, it should normally begin from the upper note, not the principal note, as we so often hear. There are, of course, exceptions. The chain of trills in Mozart's rondo in A minor K511 or those in Haydn's variations in F minor, since the trills in these two passages serve a melodic purpose, insisting on beginning from the upper note sounds, in my opinion, awkward. Aesthetically speaking, very short trills on passing 8th or 16th notes should also begin from the principal note, not the upper note. Sometimes there simply isn't enough time to fit 4 notes, and 3 notes may sound more natural, less forced. This is a case-by-case situation, though. Generally speaking, we should approach trills as beginning from the upper note. By the end of the 18th century, long trills increasingly came to be approached as beginning from the principal note, and it seems that there might have been a transitional period in which a composer would use both formulas, even within the same piece or even within the same passage. The opening page of Beethoven's Sonata in F minor, Opus 57, Appassionata, for example, shows trills that should begin from the principal note when preceded by a small print note. In this case, for example, the C leads to D, the principal note, where the trill begins. But a few measures later, no small print note appears, which seems to indicate that the trill should begin from G, the upper note, unless, of course, one prefers the quick repetition of the F. By the second decade of the 19th century, beginning from the principal note had become the general consensus. This was perhaps also because in piano music, trills began to be used texturally, unlike in keyboard works from earlier times. If a trill didn't have a melodic function, then there was no reason to begin it from the upper note. And there were ways to indicate that a trill should begin from the upper note if needed. Here is what Robert Schumann notated in the first movement of the Fantasy in C major, Opus 17, to show trills beginning from the upper note, a grace note preceding the trill representing the upper note itself. Chopin, however, did not conform at all to this new convention. He generally treated long trills according to the older 18th century tradition, beginning from the upper auxiliary note. This was perhaps because of his education rooted, through Givny, in 18th century aesthetics. So, how do we actually play trills in Chopin? I've put together what is essentially an instruction manual, as I mentioned, covering the most common situations. Trills that appear by themselves or accompanied by small print notes, as well as various exceptions. The first distinction is between long and short trills, since they often require different solutions. Let's begin with long trills. The first example comes from measure 7 of the Nocturne in E flat major, Opus 9, number 2. This is a long trill that features what we call a resolution, the two small print notes at the end. The trill is written above an F, and it should begin from the upper note G, even though it's preceded by a G, the same note as the upper note itself. Bach would have notated it as follows. I made a video about this specific trill, which adds more information about it if you're interested. We find the same kind of trill in measure 6 of the Nocturne in F minor, Opus 55, number 1. The trill is written over B flat, so the upper note is C. It should begin on the upper note, even though the C has already appeared earlier in the measure. In this nocturne, each return of this passage features a varied solution. It gives us the opportunity to introduce a particular formula that Chopin uses extensively, a trill preceded by small print figurations. In measure 14, for example, the trill is now preceded by two small print notes, A natural and B flat. There is evidence in some of the scores that Chopin's students used during their lessons that Chopin expected small print figurations to align with the bass. Following this principle, in this case, the first small print note, the A natural, should fall on the beat aligned with the B flat in the bass. The following B flat is then the principal note of the trill. If the trill were to begin on a B flat, we would hear the same note twice in immediate succession, once as the small print note and again as the first note of the trill, creating an awkward hiccup in the figuration. Beginning the trill from the upper note C avoids this repetition and allows the written out figure to flow naturally into the trill. The same notation appears in the Nocturne in G minor, Opus 37, number 1, where once again the first small print note aligns with the bass. One last example, and perhaps one of the trills that pianists most frequently play incorrectly, the opening of the nocturne in E flat major, opus 55, number 2. We hear all sorts of interpretations of this passage. But if we follow Chopin's notation carefully, the correct interpretation is this. Bach would have notated these trills as follows. Here are two trills in the ballade in A flat major, opus 47, preceded by small print notes, but not featuring a resolution. Earlier, I mentioned the chain of trills in Mozart and Haydn. Chopin's Nocturne in B major, opus 62, number 1, contains a passage reminiscent of those examples, though much more extensive, and perhaps Chopin's most famous passage involving long trills. Once we remember that long trills in Chopin generally begin from the upper note, the notation here becomes almost self-explanatory. Whenever a grace note or small print note representing the principal note precedes the trill, we should assume that Chopin intended for the trill to begin from the principal note. The grace note placed before a trill that begins from the upper note makes the trill itself, perceptually, sound as though it had begun from the principal note. This is exactly what Schumann did with grace notes in the trills of his Fantasy Opus 17, only indicating the exact opposite. In Measure 74, Chopin even writes out the opening alternations in progressively shorter note values before switching to a trill sign. For the transition from the written out trill to the actual trill to continue naturally, the trill must begin from the upper note. Otherwise, the trill would be interrupted by a repeated note. These examples, along with many others, are convincing evidence that Chopin intended his trills to begin from the upper note. We find direct confirmation of this principle in the Barcarolle Opus 60, where Chopin's fingering indicates that the trill begins with fingers 1-5, which refer to the upper notes, followed by 2-4 or 2-3, which refer to the principal note. But surprise, surprise. Surprise, surprise. Of course, there are exceptions. Some long trills sound more convincing when beginning from the principal note. I would argue that the very long trills in the opening of the Waltz Opus 42 or in the recapitulation of the Waltz in D flat major Opus 64 number 1 fall into this category. And just as in the chain of trills in Mozart and Haydn, where one would probably not begin from the upper note, there are chains of trills in two Chopin works in which I would probably avoid beginning from the upper note. The first one is featured just before the recapitulation in the impromptu in A-flat major, opus 29. The second leads into one of the first reprises in the Polonaise in A-flat major, opus 53. What about short trills, especially those on passing 16th or 8th notes? It depends. A single flip beginning on the principal note is often the more convincing solution, in my opinion. Two examples occur in the same measure of the nocturne in E-flat major, opus 9, number 2, where beginning on the upper note, making the trill 4 notes long rather than 3, would sound unnecessarily cumbersome, also because the note immediately beforehand would be repeated. I realize that this is a contradiction with some of the examples earlier, but in these cases the upper note would get repeated in close proximity, which, it seems to me, makes the melodic line less linear. Examples of short trills on quick note values appear in the opening theme of the Mazurka in C major, opus 56, number 2. Another appears in the Mazurka in C minor, opus 30, number 1. I'd like to end this video by looking at a trill in the Berceuse in D-flat major, opus 57, a trill that is often misunderstood, I believe. Some pianists misconstrue the first trill of this sequence as involving B double flat followed by B flat. Some also begin the trill from the principal note. Let's begin with the actual notes involved. If the principal note of the trill is B, whether natural, flat, double flat, sharp, or double sharp, its upper auxiliary note will always be some form of C. Here, Chopin places a small print flat sign above the trill, indicating that the upper auxiliary note should be lowered. In other words, the flat sign applies to the C, making it C flat. If the trill begins from the upper note, as Chopin's long trills generally do, the sequence therefore proceeds from the preceding C into C flat, followed by B double flat as the trill continues, which makes the first two notes of the trill sound as if they were the continuation of the scale. To sum up, Chopin generally conceived trills according to older 18th century conventions, beginning from the upper note. This is a fundamental principle for understanding how his trills should be played. But as we have seen, there are exceptions, both in long and short trills. Ultimately, context remains the deciding factor. And perhaps this is the larger lesson. When approaching Chopin, we shouldn't treat notation as a collection of isolated signs to be interpreted according to whatever convention happens to be most familiar to us. Nor should we simply ballpark an ornament and trust that instinct will tell us what sounds right. Our instinct is shaped by the musical language we have absorbed, and that language, unfortunately, is not necessarily Chopin's. Is playing a trill that should begin from the upper note, starting instead from the principal note, actually bad? Maybe not. But the point is that we can do better than simply trusting our instinct. Understanding the aesthetic behind the notation, the traditions Chopin inherited, the way he understood harmony and melody, and the expressive principles that informed his playing, is not beyond our reach. The goal then isn't to suppress instinct, but to educate it, so that what eventually feels natural to us comes as close as possible to the kind of naturalness that belonged to Chopin himself.